Hero Time, Chapter 47, The War Begins. Jen did not sleep well that night. She spent most of it researching techno-organic species on the hookup to the extranet Kevin had given her. Most of the information she found was on galvanic mechamorphs, but here and there were a few articles that classified people with specific kind of cybernetic enhancements as techno-organics, using the term as more of a subspecies classifier than a species in and of itself. Jen wasn't sure if that was better or not. She did manage to catch a few hours of sleep, which was a good thing because she was going to Julie's tennis match later that day. The set began later in the day and was about halfway over when someone sat down next to her. Jen paid him no attention for a few moments. "Gumball?" She froze. Turning quickly, she found herself face to face with Professor Paradox, still looking as he had back in La Soledad. He selected a gumball from the bag and offered the bag to Jen. She frowned. "It's time, isn't it?" Paradox nodded, still looking grim. "I'm afraid so." He stood, and she followed him without a backward glance. Julie would understand. The fate of the world hung in the balance, after all. Paradox stopped in the hallway and pulled his watch from his pocket. He offered Jen his arm, and she took it. He clicked the watch, and the two of them vanished in a flash of blue light. Gwen was reading a very dull book, The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Despite what the title implied, it was actually a philosophical introspection about the author's journey across the United States on his motorcycle. But given that the last time Gwen had taken a trip across the country, she'd ended up with powers and her cousin had ended up with a device that altered her on a level beyond their comprehension, the author's journey was not all that exciting. She was just wishing for a distraction when a bright blue light filled a room. She leapt to her feet and blinked as Jen let go of Paradox's arm. "It's time. You still with me?" Gwen's stomach plummeted at the implication, but she nodded and took her cousin's offered hand. She smiled at the redhead and took Paradox's arm again. The three of them vanished in another flash of light. Kevin was prepping for the car show. Ed had given him the invite. It wasn't like he'd gotten to go to the last one that had come to town since the incursions had invaded. This time, though, he was excited to see what he would find, though it wouldn't be anything like some of the car shows he'd been to off-world. He was still looking forward to it. That was until a bright blue light flashed next to the car. When he blinked, he found Paradox standing next to him, Jen and Gwen with him, both girls looking grim. He snapped the trunk of the car closed. So much for the car show. But they weren't the only ones Paradox had brought. The news of the destruction of the majority of the populace of Galvan Prime was nerve-wracking. The Galvans had a much more technologically advanced defensive grid than Earth had ever had. Paradox checked his watch. Jen stepped forward. "Our only shot is to stop the Highbreed before they can bring the fleet through the jump gate." Azimuth nodded. "It should be easy enough to find." Jen nodded to him. "We already know where it is. The arch is in La Soledad." Kevin frowned. "So the three of us are gonna take on an army?" Jen shook her head. "No, not just the three of us. We've run across a bunch of plumbers' kids. Most of them owe us. It's time we called in our favors. We'll go to Cooper first. Hopefully he's finished enough of the guns." Azimuth jumped in front of Jen. "You will do no such thing. Let your teammates gather the troops. I would speak to the wielder of my Omnitrix alone." Kevin shook his head. "Heck no, I'm not missing this. Have fun talking to Cooper, Gwen." Kevin teased. Gwen grabbed his arm and bodily dragged him to Paradox. "Kevin Ethan Levin, you are coming with me." Jen laughed. Your name is Kevin E. Levin? Oh, you just lost all trace of cool guy you had left." She chuckled as Kevin and Gwen disappeared with Paradox. Her face fell as she turned back to Azimuth. She held out her hands, and he jumped up onto them. She frowned at him. "You lied to me." He took a deep breath. "So you have been made aware that the Omnitrix turned me into something non-human, even when I'm human?" "Yeah." Azimuth nodded slightly as Jen set him on top of Kevin's car so she could argue with him eye to eye. "That was not something I foresaw. The Omnitrix has bonded itself to you, both on a physical and metaphysical level. Your life energy has become bound to it. Your grandmother and I spoke about this." Jen rolled her eyes. Of course Grandma Verdona knew and hadn't told her. She was only interested in Gwen. "You are part of the Omnitrix, and it is part of you. Two halves made whole." "I can't ever take it off again, can I?" Azimuth shook his head. I would advise against it. It would be like removing one of your vital organs. It may not result in immediate death, but that would be the most likely outcome in the long term. Jen closed her eyes for a moment but shook her head. That doesn't matter right now. She couldn't think about this now. She had a war to fight. She couldn't be getting distracted now. What matters right now is stopping the hybrid. No, that is not all that matters. The hybrid have taken out the population of dozens of worlds. You are what matters now. Jen frowned. What are you talking about? In your Earth culture, you have a story about a man on a boat with 2 of every animal riding out an extinction-level event. Jen nodded. Yeah, Noah's Ark. The Omnitrix was not merely built as a tool for learning, as I told you when you were a child. It is a failsafe for the universe. A Noah's Ark, capable of reviving any of the million species within it. You are the only hope those worlds have of being restored. I cannot let you risk that on this war. Jen stared at Azimuth incredulously. She shook her head and picked him up off the roof of the car, opening the door. He protested as she set him down inside the car. Wait there. I need a smoothie. She shut the door before he could protest. Everyone's gotta adjust completely upend my worldview these days, huh? She muttered as she stepped over to the window. She ordered 2 smoothies, a large for herself and a kid's for Azimuth. It didn't seem right not to get him one, even if he'd been lying to her for years. She stalked back over to the car and opened the driver's door, setting Azimuth's smoothie down in the cup holder and stabbing the straw into it with a bit more violence than was strictly necessary. The lid to her cup got a similar treatment. She took a long slurp of the frozen concoction before she spoke again. So, you're telling me that not only am I now stuck to the Omnitrix forever, as it is a new, heart? Brain? Whatever, vital piece of me, but also that I have the ability to, with the Omnitrix, revive whole species? Azimuth nodded, taking a cautious sip of his smoothie. In essence, yes. That is why you are too valuable to risk in a fight. Jen shook her head, taking a long draw from her straw. No. No? No. I'm not leaving my friends and family to fight this alone. I may be Noah's Ark now. She said it with sarcastic air quotes around the term. But that doesn't make me more valuable than anyone on my team. Azimuth frowned. I will not allow it. Jen turned on him, her glare cold. And how exactly do you plan to stop me? You just told me that that taking the Omnitrix off isn't an option anymore. Azimuth paused as though he hadn't considered that. Then he sighed. Fine. If you insist on this foolishness, then you should have the full power of the Omnitrix. Access master control. Jen felt the power surge through the Omnitrix and blinked as her vision in one eye blurred for a moment. It resolved quickly and Azimuth frowned slightly. An interesting side effect. Jen ignored him and flipped down Kevin's sunshade, sliding open the mirror within. She blinked and stared at her eye. Her right eye, the one on the same side as the Omnitrix, had changed. The pupil had split in 2 and spread, leaving her eye identical to the symbol of the Omnitrix itself, a green hourglass. She blinked, but it didn't go away. Has it affected your sight at all? Azimuth asked, sounding curious. I don't see a difference. How many aliens can I access? All 1,912 DNA samples available. The voice of the Omnitrix echoed in her head, and she blinked. Neat. Azimuth rolled his eyes, but didn't have time to say more as the door to Kevin's car opened, making them both jump. Get out of my seat, Tennyson. What happened to your eye? Gwen shoved Kevin out of the way. We brought backup. She smiled slightly, though concern flashed through her eyes at the sight of Jen's newly altered eye. Jen stepped out of the car and nodded around. Alan Albright stood next to Julie, ship on the Asian girl's shoulder. Cooper stood in a giant robot suit next to Darkstar, trying his best to look intimidating. Paradox stood off to the side, selecting another gumball. Jen took a deep breath. Thanks for coming. I know some of you really don't want to be here, she eyed Darkstar. But as of this moment, we are all that stands between Earth and the hybrid. The plan is simple. We're going to go in and take down the hyperspace gate. Cooper, did you bring the guns? The blonde nodded, and a compartment on his suit opened. There were 7 guns sitting in a neat row there. These are something Coop and I developed, Jen explained, handing them out. They'll cure the DNAliens, which will clear a path for us to the gate. We get there, we break it. She handed the last gun to Paradox. Alan frowned. Won't you need one? Cooper frowned. I only had enough time to make 7. Jen shook her head. No, I shouldn't need one. I have this. She tapped the Omnitrix, and Paradox laid a hand on her shoulder. Remember, timing is everything, Jen. She nodded to him, despite not having any idea what he was talking about. She turned back to the others. Any problems we have with each other, any personal agendas, they get left here. As of this moment, we are at war. She nodded to Paradox, and the group disappeared in a flash of blue light. Chapter 48. Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. It was working spectacularly at first. It didn't take them long to get to the arch. Jen cleared a path, blasting DNAliens as upchuck, tying them up as swamp fire, rolling through the front lines as cannon bolt. And if she was honest, she had never felt better or freer. The master control let her change with not just a word, but a thought. Mid-swing and more fluidly than she'd ever managed it before. It was exhilarating. But breaking the arch turned out to be more difficult than Jen had thought. She screamed, the sound echoing around them from Waybig's lungs as the arch activated in her grip, sending her crashing to the ground. She didn't even have time to worry if she'd landed on her team or not, before her eyes slipped closed. Gwen cried out as Waybig vanished, a sure sign that Jen was unconscious, if not worse. She raced off, Kevin keeping pace with her as they slid into the crater Waybig had left behind. The rest of the team not far behind them, none of them noticing, Darkstar slip off in the shadows. Jen was in the center of the crater, pushing herself back to her feet, looking slightly charred. But she hadn't lost either the determined look nor the hourglass in her eye. She stretched slightly and took a deep breath. Okay. She looked up at the ships overhead. New plan. Kevin, Gwen, you're with me. We're going to break into that main control tower and force the hybrid in charge to stop the invasion. The rest of you are on crowd control. Take out as many of the DNAliens as you can. The others nodded. Jen glanced around. Paradox wasn't here. She picked up Azimuth and handed him to Cooper. Keep him safe, Cooper. The blonde nodded and the team split. With the modifications Kevin had made to his car, it was relatively easy to reach the tower, though going up the stairs afterward took a minute. There was no elevator or even railings. Jen shook her head and ran faster as more ships came through the gate. She was never more grateful to have picked swamp fire than when the hybrid she was fighting slashed its claws fully through her head, severing many of the vines there. Kevin came to Gwen screaming in rage and despair. He shoved himself up from where the hybrid had thrown him and turned to find a scene out of a nightmare waiting for him. Jen was on the ground, aloe pooling under where Swampfire's head had been. But surprisingly, that wasn't the worst of it. Gwen was flickering, her normal human appearance quickly swallowed by deep purple skin and bright pink strands of energy that served as hair. Her eyes, green, nearly identical to Jen's, though a shade darker, blurred. The color vanished, replaced with a bright white glow as the hybrid who'd thrown Kevin was sent sailing out the window, which melted at the power of the explosion. There was nothing Kevin could do for Jen, but he wasn't about to lose Gwen. He couldn't. He raced to her. It was hard to get near her. The very air around her was practically crackling with power, but he refused to give up. He made it to her and grabbed her arms, feeling his palms heat up. Gwen, so much power! Her voice was doubled. He almost didn't recognize it. You have to let go of it, Gwen. No. She sounded sure of herself even as she shook in his grip. I think I can beat the hybrid. All by myself. They'll pay for what they did to my family. It was then that Swampfire's head reformed and Jen vaulted back to her feet. Okay, now you pissed me off. Kevin let out a breath as Jen decked the hybrid commander. He refocused on Gwen, who was still in full anodite mode, but had stopped shaking with the revival of her cousin. Your grandma said it would take 75 years at least to master that power. We don't even have 75 minutes, Kevin.
Jen will find another way. Please. Come back, Gwen. I can't lose you. Please.
His voice broke and the heat retreated. He looked back up and smiled at Gwen, once again a human teenager. He pulled her into his arms and held her there for a minute. Then she was grabbing his face and her tongue was in his mouth. It took him a minute to remember where he even was. Only the soft laughter from Swampfire pulled his attention away from Gwen. Sweet, Julie owes me money. Jen turned away from them to the Highbreed she trapped in vines. Now, call off the attack. The Highbreed laughed.
Presumptuous child. I do not have the authority to stop the invasion. Only the Highbreed Supreme may do such a thing, and he is safe on the homeworld. You've lost this war.
Jen frowned. The world on the other side of that jump gate? It was then that the DNAlien backup showed up, but someone else showed up too. Nanny! Gwen called out, excited. A blast of wind and disappearing weapons heralded Helen. The spikes flying into the guns preceded her brother Pierce, who grinned. Jen wasn't paying attention to him, though. That means... Hey, kids. Both Jen and Gwen turned to the hole in the tower, grinning like maniacs as Max Tennyson rode up to the hole on a Null Guardian. Both girls ran to him as he landed the creature. Jen transformed mid-step, racing into her grandfather's arms. I thought you were staying in the Null Void until you sorted things out. Max smiled at Gwen, who'd spoken. Jen was still holding on to him.
We've got things mostly sorted there. The rest can be handled by the natives. Besides, I wasn't going to set out the final round with the Highbreed.
Jen nodded as she pulled back from the hug. Okay, I have a plan. Grandpa, you and the plumber's kids. Manny interrupted her. Max Force.
What did I say about calling us that?
Manny shrugged at Max.
I think it's cool.
Jen laughed. You and the Max Force hold the line here. Stop them from taking back the control room. Gwen, you have your phone? Gwen nodded and handed her the device. Answer the phone, Julie. Ah, good. We need ship. Yes, right now. Thank you. Jen stepped over to the hole Gwen had blasted into the tower. Pierce stepped forward.
What are you doing?
Oh, just stepping out for some air. She then stepped out of the tower into thin air. Jen! Max shouted after her, only to roll his eyes as she came back into sight, standing on ship.
You really need to stop doing that.
Where would be the fun in that? Gwen, Kevin, come on. The two teens laughed and chased after Jen, hopping into the ship just before it took off toward the gate. Flying ship as Brainstorm had been a great idea. Spectacular even, but landing a hurt ship as Brainstorm was not so much. She was already feeling unusually scrambled. The fact that her seatbelt had vanished with her transformation did not help. She ended up slamming into the back door and tumbling down the ramp as ship opened it. She groaned and her eyes rolled up into her head. She went limp on the ground as footsteps approached. They'd been hoping Jen was all right as they raced out of the ship. Azimuth on Kevin's shoulder, finding her out cold in the hands of a Highbreed, was the worst outcome they could have gotten.
Do not move, vermin, or this one dies.
The Highbreed held Jen in one hand. The other had sharp claws under her chin, poised to rip the skin there.
Stop! We surrender.
Azimuth called out before Gwen or Kevin could speak. Kevin made to speak, but Azimuth kicked him in the chin. He raised his hands and Gwen followed suit. The Highbreed laughed.
Good. The Galvin are supposed to be more intelligent than the average vermin. You will walk now. The Highbreed Supreme will decide your fate after the invasion.
None of them dared to argue as the giant alien still held Jen, who didn't look like she'd be waking up anytime soon. They were marched into a holding cell and bound. Gwen was counting the minutes in her head. They had maybe an hour at Azimuth's estimate before the Highbreed fleet was all in La Soledad and could uncloak and begin their attack. She just prayed Jen would wake up soon.